Welcome, folks. We are just beyond thrilled to have you with us. My name is Dr. Devin Geary, just Devin, and I'm a senior program manager with the Institute for Common Power. And I also run these trainings with Mary for Dialogue for Democracy. And we've been doing this for a while now and are just really passionate about holding the space for the conversations that we'll get to have today.
Hello, hello. My name's Mary, and I'm a trainer at Common Power. I work with Devin at Dialogue for Democracy. Can't wait to do this work with you.
Absolutely. But we wanted to talk a little bit about this program and what it's all about. So we offer at Common Power a few different trainings. You've got 101, 102, 103, and then you have 201, which is this volunteer training. And the purpose of this training is to really help us be very mindful and intentional when we're in community together, and specifically when we're in diverse communities. So Common Power does this incredible thing, this radical thing of bringing people together across the country from all different positionalities, all different lived experiences, and they bring them together to go after a shared goal, a shared political goal of fighting for a more just, inclusive, and equitable democracy and society. And so we want to create a space where we can talk about ways to be more thoughtful and mindful and intentional around thinking about our identity and our positionality and power, especially as we navigate these diverse spaces together and we knock on doors in communities that aren't ours. So that's what Dialogue for Democracy is all about. So I have a few quick notes, and then I'll give us kind of a run of show what we're going to get up to today. I got my degree in communication, and one myth that I love busting is that we cannot multitask. We like to believe that we're very skilled at being able to do 5 things at once, but really what our brain is doing is shutting off one activity and fully focusing on another. When you're multitasking, you just do that quickly, but it doesn't enable you to do any one of those things fully. So if you want to get as much as you can out of today, be 100% fully with us. The third piece is if you look at Mary and I, you'll notice something. We both look very similar in terms of our race and our gender. We are both white women. And if we're going to be leading a conversation about identity and about positionality, we want to start with our own. We have been socialized as white women. I cannot parse out who I am as Devin from who I am as a white woman. It is intertwined and has been since birth. Mary and I try to be very mindful of our identities. We think about them every day, but that doesn't mean that we still don't have blind spots, that we still don't make mistakes. And we just try to model being very aware of that and taking accountability when that happens. So that's kind of our little intro spiel. Let me give you a little bit of a rundown about what we want to do with you today. So the first thing is that we want to share our values for ambitious conversations. Those are really important, and those should be foundational for us, whether you're doing something with Common Power or just engaging day to day. Second thing we'll do is a deep listening exercise that'll build from those values. The third is talking about structural bias and generational wealth as a way of discussing the history that shaped the neighborhoods and communities that we'll all be navigating through as we canvass. The fourth thing is to talk about the limbic system, implicit bias, and accountability. And then last, we're going to work through some scenarios to practice that intentionality around identity and power when we're on the ground, both with each other and when you're at the doors engaging with other people. So that's what we got for you today. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mary to go over those values.
All right, we usually start here with values. We like to think of these values as the container in order to have these conversations. We call them values for open dialogue and ambitious conversation. And think of these values as something that you can lean on when things get a little bit rough out there. So we're going to popcorn share, and I'll start by reading Curiosity. Curiosity is a must. You can't enter a difficult, complex, or ambitious conversation without a curious interest to listen and learn from a multitude of perspectives. And I will pass it to Jordan.
Deep listening is a way of giving our full attention to understand another point of view. Most often, we listen to respond. Here, we listen to understand. I'll pass it to Jessica.
One conversation is essential. As people share their perspectives, they should have the full attention of everyone in the room or at the table. One shares, the rest of us listen. And I'll pass it to Celestia.
Thank you. Respect, to create openness and inclusiveness, to have an inclusive discussion where everyone shares and no one voice dominates. We have a bedrock of respect for each perspective. Now we'll pass it to MJ.
Thank you, Celestia. Trust. Clawing away at provocative questions in our culture opens us up to complex ideas that need the oxygen of discussion to understand. Creating this open dialogue has to happen to find new solutions and realize connections that we hadn't found before.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing these. One other thing I would ask you to do when you take a look at this list, look at curiosity, deep listening, respect, trust, and just find a value that really comes easily to you and identify that. And then find a value that's a little bit more challenging for you. I would say deep listening is typically a value in our culture that's a challenge for folks. Definitely has been a challenge for me, but it can be transformative when we come together in these spaces. And it's a little different than the normal way that we go about our daily day listening to other folks. Usually we listen to respond, but in this particular way, we listen and we give our full attention just to understand that person's point of view, just to listen, just to deeply give them space. So I'll just let those sit there for a moment.
One quick thing I'll say on that is that we can't control how people show up, right? But we can control how we show up. And so often how we model communication, someone will mirror that. So it really helps. Curiosity, deep listening, giving space. You're modeling a way of behaving with each other that can help the conversation. So with that said, we're going to talk first about macro kind of structural bias and racism. And then Mary's going to talk about micro interpersonal bias. So that's kind of where we're headed next. Let me share my slides. We like this definition of structural racism by Dr. Zinzi Bailey. She's a professor at the University of Minnesota. And she says structural racism is the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. In other words, it's everywhere. These patterns and practices in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and the distribution of resources. So this highlights how things that happen at the macro level influence what happens at that micro interpersonal level. All right, so we're talking about these macro forces of structural racism, like housing, because when we're canvassing with common power, we're entering a diverse array of neighborhoods and communities. You'll be knocking on doors in likely gated communities and middle-class neighborhoods and predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, areas of the country that have experienced deep impoverishment and struggle, as well as areas that are experiencing wealth and prosperity. So what we want to touch on briefly are some of the historical forces that have fundamentally shaped these communities, because we know that the dominant American narrative doesn't talk about these forces. The dominant narrative fails to acknowledge specifically how much throughout history the federal government economically buoyed white people while oppressing the upward mobility of people of color. So we're going to look at the cycle of wealth and generational wealth. And we know in a capitalist society, generational wealth works like this. You buy a house, And the location of your house determines where your kids go to school. And because state and local taxes are primarily what finances schools, where you live determines how many resources your school has. How well resourced your schools are hugely influences how your kids do in school, whether they go to college, what colleges they go to, which influences where they get a job and the salary that they make. And then that in turn will influence where they live. So you can see that this can be a cycle of upward mobility, and it can also be a cycle of poverty. So buying a house specifically is and has always been one of the best methods of accumulating wealth in the United States and passing that wealth down generationally. In the case for reparations, Ta-Nehisi Coates describes how the federal government systematically shut Black Americans and other marginalized populations out from the greatest expansion of middle-class wealth in American history. We sent out the case for reparations, so if you haven't taken a look, we highly recommend that piece as a refresher. So the 1930s New Deal and GI Bill helped create a white booming middle class. White families and veterans received massive economic support from the federal government to buy homes, to go to schools, to receive vocational training. White people, in other words, received federal support to accumulate generational wealth. And I'm assuming everyone here is familiar with racial covenants, exclusionary zoning, and redlining, all practices backed by the federal government. And these practices were explicitly used to exclude Black and Brown people from building wealth. And so we see that because of this, between 1934 and 1962, people of color received just 2% of the $120 billion in housing financed by government agencies. Just want us to think about that for a sec. 2% of $120 billion. Another book we'd really recommend is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And she says, wealth is how history shows up in your wallet. So as you navigate the neighborhoods you'll be canvassing, we want you to be aware of and thinking about how this stratification of wealth, how this crushing inequity has shaped the communities across the country. The 1968 Fair Housing Act made housing and lending discrimination illegal, but we know that the act has been very, very poorly enforced, and methods like exclusionary zoning, racial steering, and predatory lending continue. And so that leads us to these realities, these contemporary realities. In 2019, 74% of white Americans owned homes compared to 42% of Black Americans. And in 2021, the typical median wealth of white households was an average of $250,000 in comparison to the typical Black household with $27,000. That's so stark. And segregation impacts everything: your access or lack of access to healthcare, grocery stores, recreational spaces, public services, education, all the social determinants of health that we also send a video out, so you can check that out. But it is your zip code more than your genetic code determines how long you're going to live. I lived in Tutwiler, Mississippi for a year, and it became clear as day that having to drive 40 minutes to a grocery store, not having a hospital nearby, all of those things hugely, hugely shape your well-being and your community's well-being. So this is all tough to share and tough to talk about because of obvious reasons. But at the same time, we want to emphasize that that's why we're here. That's why we are working with an organization like Common Power, who's going door to door, getting folks to get out and vote for people that are aware of these histories, are not trying to push those histories under the carpet, want to redress historical inequity, and fight for a more just, inclusive democracy.
So now we're going to move a little bit in a different direction. We're going to, from the macro to the interpersonal. And one of the ways that we look at this. I'm just going to open with this question. How do you solve conflict within a community whose mission is to build diverse and inclusive community? And how do you thrive doing it? So one of the central things that we share is this concept of conflict and how it relates to healthy community building. Accountability is critical. Accountability is actually a core value in our community building at CP, and you cannot have healthy community without a measure of accountability. So that's where we aim for, but you cannot have healthy community without a measure of conflict. It's a diverse community that we're building, which is radical and beautiful and extremely necessary to get to a just and inclusive democracy. And when we build diverse coalitions and community, each of us brings along our historical selves. So there will be some conflict. This is just a fact, right? It's built in. And how we meet this, how Devin and I meet this, is by doing the following. We really want to educate folks about their systems, about implicit bias, about what occurs when bias activates our limbic systems. And then from there, talk a little tiny bit about how healthy community functions when it's tested, and introduce a couple of tools, not as extensively as we could definitely speak to this, some techniques of breath work and empathy, which are known to work really well to ground folks when there are moments of tension. So let's talk a little bit about our bias. What's implicit bias? Where do our biases come from? And then furthermore, can we still be good people if we hold implicit bias? Well, any one of us in this group, this gathering today, could speak to implicit bias and its destructive effects, right? We each hold a multitude of identities that comes under attack, as the researcher Claude Steele says, at least 2 times a day. Our race, our age, our gender, our political affiliations, our height, physical abilities, body size, mental health, all of these are just a few identifiers that are ways that we're sorted and stored and then responded to by others in our daily lives. And to quote Ms. Myers, biases are the stories that we make up about folks we don't know before we know who they are and what they're capable of. Implicit bias actually happens unconsciously. Part of our memory stores is where they're activated from. And biases are informed by the stories that we've absorbed through our entire lives. So through the media, the dinner table conversation, our books, our fables, our myths, billboards, movies, you name it, that all goes into creating these narratives and these structural stories that we live by. It's important to remember that although implicit bias operates in this subconscious level, these organic biases are not completely inflexible and can be interrupted. So our social identities come with a set of social expectations. And when these expectations are challenged, they can arise as a triggering threat. And then we have feelings and our bodies react physically. So let me give you the example that Verna Myers uses in her TED Talk, which we love. It's a perfect example of this, where she experienced the immediate feeling of ebullition and empowerment to be flown by a female pilot. And yet when the aircraft hits turbulence, this taps in to her implicit bias of preferring a man in spaces where there's danger. So this is a really, really great example of implicit bias being received as a triggering threat. The turbulence occurs, the thought emerges where it is lifted up from the subconscious to the conscious place. Her social set of expectations is being challenged in this moment. It becomes a triggering threat. I'm not safe. I would feel better if, which then triggers her limbic system activating. So she goes into fight, flight, freeze. And there are 3 key pieces, or actually 4 key pieces of that. There are more than that, but I'll just higher blood pressure, heart rate, your breathing elevates. And this last piece is very key. Your prefrontal cortex actually goes offline when you're having a limbic flare, okay? That's the freeze part, because your body is, you are in a danger situation. That's the limbic system. So this is a bit of more information. The limbic system is the part of the brain involved in our behavior and emotional responses, especially when it comes to behaviors we need for survival. It's our danger warning signal. In no way, shape, or form am I suggesting that the limbic system is not here to help us, but it also can be fed by erroneous information that we need to challenge, right? A couple other things to note about the limbic system. It's where our memory storage meets our emotional response. And again, it's this part of the brain that's used for survival. So our limbic system can obviously activate for a variety of different reasons. Safety is one of these reasons, right? I'm not safe. I would feel better if. Anger is another. So we talked about fear, or the feeling of unsafety triggering the limbic system. Now let's talk a bit about anger as a limbic trigger. The limbic system can flare when we are under stereotype threat and we go into the anger mode or the fight modality. When somebody's on the receiving end of bias, for instance, that might make them actually angry. So I'll just give you a quick example. Nevada, 114 degrees, day 4, it's me, I'm an introvert. Social battery at about a half, right? I've been knocking on doors, I've been having dinner with a lot of you all, right? Been in the cars, there's a lot of talk, I didn't sleep that well. And again, if I didn't already say it, it's really hot. And I have a new partner today, and it's Devin. And she's about 30 years my senior, and she takes one look at me, and she has her own set of biases that she brings to me. I'm older, doesn't look like I can really sprint that fast. There's a lot of turf to be covered, and she's ambitious, right? She might see my flushed red cheeks, and she offers me this as an option. She tells me that maybe I should sit in the car where there's air conditioning, right? So I'm not all that well resourced. And instead of cooling myself down, taking a deep breath, doing all of the things that I know how to do with my body, I might actually get angry. But because I understand what's happening in my system, what I do next is really the key part, right? So instead of freezing or fleeing, I'm not scared, I'm angry. My blood pressure goes up, elevated, a limbic flare is occurring. What I do next is not yell at her, right? What I do next, because I understand what's happening, is I might breathe. I might walk it off. I might say, hey girl, you take that side of the street. I'll take this side of the street. Go as far as you like, but I'm not sitting in the car. I might decide that I'm going to talk to her, but talk to her later, after I cool down, after I bring my system back online, especially my prefrontal cortex, which is my thinking brain. Okay, so that's example number 2. Now let's talk a little bit about a moment with our limbic system and how it can trigger when we don't feel heard or listened to or respected, say at the door. Let's say I meet a voter at the door who doesn't share my candidates or my political views. And they say to me that they believe that a woman's right to choose is a sin and that my candidate has gone too far. How I respond to this voter can mean the difference between a limbic trigger for both of us, potentially, if I come out of the gate in a strong and aggressive kind of way, and really puts the conversation or persuasion, just what we talked about earlier, that deep listening, that curiosity, that puts it completely out the window, because I can't hear them and they cannot hear me at that point. We are not meeting in the middle, and maybe we don't need to. However, if I bring the values of curiosity and deep listening, then perhaps there is some interaction that can happen in that instance. At the very least, I don't walk away having a limbic flare and them having a limbic flare as well. Okay, so the fourth example I'm going to give you is just simply that there, again, to underscore that there's a variety of ways that the limbic system can be triggered and will be triggered and is triggered. And yet how we behave with each other in community as CP volunteers in these cars, in these meetings, at these dinners, is really the most important thing that I want to leave you with. So let's say I'm me. Let's say I'm a 60-year-old woman and I'm out there in the cars, white woman, I might add, out there in the cars, and I'm saying some offensive stuff. And I'm using terms that are derogatory that I might not even really know. I have not taken the time to educate myself. And it's day 4, and everyone else's social battery is about here, and they're tired of it. I'm starting to wear on people. And I've been pulled aside by my team lead, Devin. And she has taken the time with me to explain that what I've said was problematic and framing it as a you did, not a you are conversation. She talks to me about implicit bias and that we all have it, and that I need to challenge this and that I need to reflect on it. I need to interrupt it. And yet what I hear is a confrontation, and I move to shame, even though she's calling me in. Now, there's a lot that we can say about shame, about guilt, about the shame spiral, about the way that I'm socialized, and so is Devin and many of you on this call as white people to receive accountability as an accosting kind of moment. So I would just say, if you haven't taken the time to listen to Brené Brown, the podcast that we shared, I think it's 40 minutes. I know it takes a while, but she covers this territory brilliantly, okay? So all I would say is that mistakes are always going to be made. That's who we are as human beings. All of us are going to read each other wrong, not have enough information. But in this community, we hold sacred a couple of things. And that is, if you're in our community, you're one of us. We also expect accountability. So I will leave you with this. Would like everyone to just take a moment, take a big deep breath and hold it at the top. And now slowly release your breath. And if you have the space or want to, stretch your limbs or shake them. What we just did there helps release and reset our nervous system. And the last thing I'll share about the limbic flare and limbic system is that they're contagious. So discussing a limbic flare, like we just did, witnessing a limbic flare, causes our own limbic systems to trigger. Maybe not as much as the person who's experienced it, but we have that as animals. We connect in that kind of way. So this one tool, breath work and empathy, I would say, go hand in hand, but breath work for sure is tried and true. And it's one of the tools that we introduce. It is a way to calm your system, your parasympathetic nervous system, bring it back to a calm state, to tell your brain. What that does is it tells your brain that you're in a safe space, okay? Navy SEALs use it. They use a box breathing to calm themselves down when they're in high stress situations. You might also know it as pranayama breathing. There are many different varieties of breathing out there that are used. There's also a lot of research and study that we're happy to share with you in terms of breath work and nervous system work and the ways in which we can calm a stressed environment and situation. So I'll just leave you with the next thing, which is a quote from really one of our all-time favorite community builders and activists, and Adrienne Maree Brown. And this is from her book, which we highly recommend, We Will Not Cancel Us. We all have work to do. Our work is in the light. We have no perfect moral ground to stand on, shaped as we are by this toxic, complex time. We must all do our work, be accountable, and go heal simultaneously, continuously. It's never too late.
So here are the values again, and just refer to these, think about these as we delve into the scenarios. All right, here we go. Scenario number 1. You've just finished your last turf of the day in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. As everyone gets into the car and the talk picks up where it left off, Susan shares, I mean, it just absolutely baffles me. The apathy around voting that I heard from so many people at the doors I talked to. Everyone nods in agreement and Jim adds, it's really surprising. I talked to so many people who have never even voted. Allie adds, they don't even know that an election is coming up. So what are folks' kind of like, as you hear that, what just thoughts come up for you?
I think for me, it's also, as they mentioned, there's so much apathy, right? And the folks who are mentioning this, I feel like there's a lack of empathy from them towards the voters that they might have account. And I say this because we know that in a lot of the neighborhoods that we are entering as Common Power, or that I've personally entered, I know that there's a lot of communities that have been disenfranchised for a long time. And I think that, of course, they may not be saying this with the, with that intention, but we also must be aware of where we are in the city or the place that we're in, and kind of take a step back and maybe question, like, why is it that these folks, haven't had that access yet?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with what MJ said, because I think on the surface level, like the statement seems like pretty neutral. It seems like it's just an observation that people are talking about, but I think a lot of it is about the subtext and about whether or not people take it a step further and ask those questions like, oh, maybe why is it this way? Maybe there's a reason, maybe there's a system at play. And so I think this one is like, I feel like I hear this all the time in the field. People make a lot of observations, but there has to be, I think, here at Common Power and in our community specifically, a push to question more, to talk further and deeper about observations we make.
I agree with everything you guys said. I immediately thought of empathy as well, MJ, with them describing the apathy that the individuals they spoke to at the doors felt, because like you said, the neighborhood, cities, towns, whatever it is, understanding the circumstances and the systems at play, like Jessica mentioned, that are affecting these people is what we really have to be thinking about going into those spaces. So just like you said, really coming in with empathy and that curiosity is super important. So that's exactly what I thought of as well.
Awesome. Anything else that comes to mind, or do we feel like we've kind of covered it?
I think it would be, first thing I thought was like, in terms of how we would respond. I don't know if it's like a bias just because of like who's in the call right now and stuff, but I feel like the fact that we're able to kind of say like, how you probably heard, like, just to the car, like, how you probably heard like in David's lectures or like Dr. Scott's lectures about like, this is really baffling stuff, and like kind of turn it towards a more like, this is why we're taking action, I guess. Like to say, because I feel like there's sometimes where, at least when it comes to like even just talking about voting or like voter suppression or anything like that, um, it's really it makes it a lot easier, at least for me, like to go into like the personal experience where it's like I didn't even like without Seattle being the way that it is, like I wouldn't have even like known when it was time for me to vote. And that would have just made me feel really bad, like the work that we're doing even to miss an election. So like the fact that we can stumble across a ballot box, but we haven't seen like one in this neighborhood, like that shows that we're in the right place, you know.
I would
That's
just also add to what everyone has said that there's an aspect of saviorism with these attitudes, that we all sort of enter these neighborhoods, with this super involved, everyone in the car is super involved. And I don't know about, all the people out there that are our volunteers, but we live in a state where we have our ballots mailed to us. And still, like, we don't even have to leave our houses to Asha's perspective, point of view about, living in Seattle. And still our turnout is somewhere around 40%. So it's like, I think that there comes this sort of, also there's just an attitude, that just because we're super engaged, it's like, why isn't everybody? So.
And I want to add a comment from someone who lives in Alabama and has gone or has experienced this. I think something that it's to all the points that what everyone says about like it's about disenfranchisement, but also it's about like just the fact that like a lot of campaigns or a lot of elections, they don't advertise it often. So when I first moved down here, I didn't know there was like a runoff race coming up or a primary race going on. I found out through like an Instagram ad one time and that was it. And that's how I knew something was going on. So in Alabama, it depends really on the state, but I'm glad this conversation has been brought up in the car, and then that comes with the discussion of everything we all talked about, and then also about them in the vehicle about, okay, so how are people even getting this information out? Because, right, it would be lovely if we had ballot boxes on every corner, but it's hard to find here. You can only vote on one day here. So it's just, you have to know where you're coming or what the state you're actually or canvassing in to understand why don't people know about this information.
1,000,000%. 1,000,000%. Yep. Voter disenfranchisement, voter suppression, like all of these things factor in the history. I loved that y'all brought up having empathy and curiosity. So, maybe asking some questions in the car about like, well, why do you think that is that people aren't voting? What could be getting in the way of that? So wonderful discussion. Let's move on to the next one. Number 2. On the last day of canvassing for Kamala Harris, you're assigned to a group including John, a white male volunteer, and Samantha, a 30-something white woman. Midday, members of the car begin discussing conversations that they've had with friends and family about volunteering with CP. John shares, when I found out Biden was endorsing Kamala, I told my wife, I don't care even if she's black. I'm going to do whatever I can to get her elected. Samantha in the backseat leans forward. Right? I don't care if she's purple or green. I don't see color. I see people. And she's way better than Trump. I mean, come on. All right. Thoughts for this one? What comes up for y'all?
I think for me, going back to what I think MJ said in the previous one, that like I can see that like there are no like bad intentions with these statements, but I also do think it might come from a place of maybe just like ignorance about like the history that's come before all Black people in America, especially voting and politics for Black people. And so to make these kind of statements that like, oh, it doesn't matter, I don't even care, I don't see color, like to someone, especially if there were a Black person in the car, in the room, like that would, I would imagine like that would feel like they're disregarding someone's entire identity. And also like the history and the violence and the suffering that Black people have endured through American history and in politics. So I feel like this statement, honestly, in my opinion, like would feel very ignorant. Yeah. But I can see that it's not from bad intentions, but there may just need to be a better understanding of like why identity really does matter and why representation matters.
Yeah, I completely agree. That was great, Jessica. And I was just gonna say too, like for John in this case, when he says, I don't care even if she's black versus like what Samantha says, like I don't see color. I feel like if, hearing John's statement, I would kind of be like, oh, like, I don't know if I want to be in the car with John anymore. Kind of because his, I don't care that she's black. Basically, like some pretenses that he feels some way towards African Americans or what, whatever it may be. Maybe he's meaning because she's a woman, maybe, but he's saying, I don't care that she's black. So obviously that had some negative connotation to him at some point, versus Samantha saying, I don't see color, which is obviously, this phrase that we've all heard and understand is problematic. So I feel like I don't know, I have like a different reaction to both of them in the sense, because in wanting to see kind of like what would happen after, or just kind of like trying to understand how to react to both of them, because I feel like I would differently almost. But definitely very ignorant comments, obviously, and like Jessica mentioned, a disregard for history and all the work that people in the car and everyone are doing. But I would be contemplating, probably in my silence, how to respond to both of them and like what the next steps would be. I don't know, that's just my initial, like, what if I was in that position, like how I would respond in my head at first.
I remember this one from the staff retreat. I feel like it just reminds me that like I feel like there's sometimes or a lot of times like just being in the car where it feels like if you're, if it's like a couple or like one or two like young people or people of color, like sometimes it feels like, or I'm sensing the vibe from like older white volunteers that they feel this need to like outperform wokeness, like to prove the, um like they're on the right side of things or whatever, or for whatever reason. And it's like it has that same feeling of like when your grandparent is at the dinner table and tries to say something like supportive, but it comes out very like the language is just all like wrong. But it's like it's okay. Like grandpa didn't mean to be racist, but like, that kind of thing. So I think taking it like in that way, I like it doesn't necessarily like bother me as much. I think with how I stand by what I said, I think at the staff retreat when I was like, I would respond by saying like I think it matters that she is black because that matters to like people who look like me and especially like little girls who look like me. And like I think it's a great thing that we acknowledge that she is black. But it doesn't have to be like I don't think it has to be a heavy thing, especially when we have these scenarios when it's coming from like a comment that like they might see to themselves as positive. I feel like it makes it easier to like acknowledge it, correct it, and then like move forward in a more positive way.
I agree with Asha. I think it's about how to correct this because you can sense the good intention of what they're trying to say, but they're not saying it the right way. So a comment like this is just that it's that perfect time to correct it, and maybe that starts a ripple of like maybe we can get this language, just stop saying this in general because it's offensive to everyone who's not white, basically, because it's very targeted towards like people of color. So correcting the language and saying that that doesn't qualify anything to her, like she's more than just being black, and that's not why we're out here. It means a lot to us for her to get elected, and let's learn how to change this language of what we're saying, especially with her being a candidate. Like it's potential where this is gonna mean a lot more to us. So yeah, correcting the language is the most important thing.
Starting to think maybe we should have y'all leading the trainings. It's so good. Okay. So here's the next scenario. Jerry, a middle-aged white woman, is the driver for your group for the day's canvassing. As she pulls into the first turf, a predominantly black neighborhood, she idles the car and turns to her group. We're definitely in the ghetto now. Do people feel safe knocking on doors? Whenever y'all are ready.
I think this is just very telling of people's, well, one, identity, but also two, their comfort, right? We talk a lot about this during our trainings and how just because you might not feel comfortable in a space doesn't mean you're necessarily like in an unsafe place, if that makes sense. So I think like by her saying, oh, we're in the ghetto now, she immediately connects that to unsafe or a threat. Especially if we connect that back to it's a Black neighborhood. So it's all the three things that she thinks is unsafe, you know? So it just immediately, I think, would trigger, you know, personally me, if I was in that car, because I don't necessarily come from an all Black neighborhood as a child or as a young woman, but I know and have, you know, I grew up in a neighborhood that it was very diverse and people look like me. And so for that, that would be offensive to me for her to connect those two things, Black people or brown people in the ghetto, immediately as a response to a threat. So that would be my first kind of like reaction, would be a honestly kind of a negative one, and kind of questioning like her, I guess, ability to maybe adapt to certain places and kind of immediately feel unsafe in a place where she's never even been before. I don't know, that's just my first kind of glance at this. I'm gonna pass it on. Oh no, I'm not gonna pass it on to anybody. Anybody want?
Saying, well, why does like this Black neighborhood makes you uncomfortable? But are you, like you said, MJ, are you unsafe here, or are you just uncomfortable because it's a new place for you? Even going into like having that conversation, say it goes well, whatever it is, like how do you then go about it? Because just because we have that conversation doesn't mean that Jerry or whoever it is like then decides, okay, now I'm fine, we can just keep going. They still it might not change much for them. It just might make them think about it, or you know, they reflect and all of that. But it's like, then what's the result? Like, how do we solve this different level of comfortability or this conversation? Sorry, that was not a solution, but I just made me think of that because I'm like, then what would you do?
I also have like not a question, but maybe like it's not quite an answer either. But I also think like, especially with this group of people on this Zoom call, like we all have very different roles when we're on the ground. Like for like me and MJ and even some of you guys who would be team leads in the field, like I would hope, I think so. I would feel like confident enough like in my like my role that I can be like, hey, like first of all, we don't use that language. Especially for you as a white person, don't say the word like this is a ghetto, or so don't say that. Then also like, you know, taking them through like, hey, like why do you feel this way? Having those whole conversations, like that's a very much like burden. I was gonna say, like that's a large conversation to have. So I feel like it also depends on like who you are in the car. Like I can see like some people are like, oh, like is this like the mindset right now? Like, are we just gonna go with whatever one person is saying? So yeah, it also depends on like where you are. If you know these people, like, are you going to be comfortable saying like, oh, like, why do you say that? Why are you saying that? Like some people won't feel that way or feel comfortable in questioning how another person is describing a neighborhood or something. Not an answer either.
No, but all great points in terms of just kind of considering this. And I like that we've almost divided it into two pieces, because do you feel safe knocking doors? Safety is something that we take seriously with CP. And so the question that MJ posed and others posed about, do you truly feel unsafe, or do you just feel uncomfortable because this is something new or unfamiliar? And so, but in kind of figuring that out, where you actually are, and if you really truly do feel unsafe, then that's something that we take into consideration, to Asha's point. And then maybe some people do and some people don't, or you call it for the day, or you know, however you go about it. But then that first piece, we're definitely in the ghetto now. I think that the saying ghetto as a white person it's not okay. And it's so historically freighted, and has such a negative connotation. And if there are Black and brown people in the car, there's harm that's caused. And so being able to, you know, speak back to notice that, and maybe say, hey, Jerry, you know, I'm if I were to do this, I'd say, hey, Jerry, you know, I'm also, as you can see, a white person. And just so you know, we can't say that word. We don't say that word because of its historical freight, because of its historical meaning, and kind of engage in a conversation about that. But I like these two conversations about kind of word choice and also safety and
Before,
comfort.
oh, yeah, sorry.
Go for it.
Before I step out, this is great. And I think that this is also, I would not call out, but call in, but also, you know, if you are somebody who's comfortable and also a white person and is able to, in a good way, interrupt this sort of situation, I ask volunteers who want to and can to do it, because although Jessica and I, you know, those would be our roles on the ground, like Jessica mentioned, it is also an emotional, you know, like emotional and also just like we shouldn't have to do that. And so I think always like appreciate a lot when other volunteers step into these situations and call it in, you know, call that person in and try to do it as fast as possible so that they can understand, you know, like we're trying to support them in a way of calling them in, you know, kind of educating a little bit rather than shaming them for it. But thank you for
Brilliant.
inviting me.
Thank you, MJ. Really appreciate you. Okay.
Adam, an older white volunteer, and Sarah, a Black woman in her mid-20s, get to the restaurant a bit later than the other people in their canvassing group. With one table left, they sit together to eat lunch. After they place their orders, Adam leans in, asking Sarah, I'm really trying to connect with young people on the trip and understand their lived experiences. What's been your experience growing up as a Black woman? What was that like? Sarah later shares that this interaction made her feel uncomfortable.
I feel like I think it's hard for me to like give like a solution for this, but more so I can just offer shared experience with this. I think it's very hard when non-people of color ask this question because it's very unfair, because many times I can't answer for anyone's experience other than my own experience. So if I were to say like living like it was like this as a Black woman, I don't know any other experience, so I can't share anything as being a Black person to this experience. But I think it is a wanting to be a good intention question to try and get to know people more, but at the same time, it's a very ignorant question in a way of you can ask me about who I am or what I went through in life rather than how my identity factored into how I grew up, because this is the only way I know how to have grown up. So I think the intention is there and it's right, but you have to understand, how are you asking questions to people that are one, younger than you, and then two, of the BIPOC community, because their experience, you can't understand a whole community's experience by one person. You can ask an individual what their life was like, but not as their identity. Because it's a very blanket question. And I think if you're trying to get to know someone of this, ask where they're from, ask more about their life rather than how their identity plays into a role of it. It's just like my advice I would go about this.
I agree. I think too, just thinking about like the power dynamic of like the older man. I'm assuming Adam is a man in this case, or more masculine presenting, to a younger woman of color, and then asking about, in this case, just like asking about her life as a Black woman, and in a, you know, they're going to lunch, more, you know, intimate setting where there's not like a group, there's not conversation that can be had. It just kind of is a little bit more like restrictive as far as like her, you know, that person's ability even to kind of like navigate out of the conversation. So like as older volunteers in that case, like being more aware of not only just these questions and then kind of like the scenarios and circumstances that people may be in. Yeah, I mean, similarly to Celestia, I can't necessarily offer a solution besides probably don't ask people that. Any, you know, any person of color that's like about their personal experience, because as Celestia said, I can only share mine. and like what my in that case of with versus an entire group of individuals. But even then, it's like your own personal life and story to choose whether or not you want to share with other individuals in your life. So I don't know, it's kind of awkward. And like imagine if that was you, like you would like if someone was asking that back. That's what I always think. Like of any scenario, I put myself in that position, like what if that was me or what if they were me? So I think that would be a good way to think about it if that were that individual. What would you how would you feel if that was you?
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said. I think this is it's just a really awkward and unfair situation because honestly, like basically, like the young woman has been like cornered because you're a one-on-one, it's an older white volunteer and you're like a young person, trying this out for the first time, and then you're kind of cornered into having this conversation that you don't want to have. I think it's really unfair. And also like it puts out like this expectation that like, oh, I'm just here to tell you what you want to hear, for you to get whatever you want out of this experience, rather than two of us experiencing this trip together. I'm just here to serve whatever you have, whatever need you have to get to know Black people or whatever. So I think it's really unfair to the young volunteer and to the BIPOC people who are on this trip in this room that they have to share their story in a way that meets their expectations or their generalizations of what the experience is. So yeah, same thing. Like I just wouldn't. And also like it's a weird question to ask. Like I wouldn't even know how to respond to that. I'd be like, I mean, I'm just here. Like I have my own life. And so it's really awkward. And yeah, it makes it uncomfortable for everyone.
I like this piece too about, I mean, everything that y'all said. We don't even need to add anything. Um, there's like two parts, the overgeneralization of like, tell me about, what the Black experience is, as if one person can surmise that. And then the second piece about that asking for that level of vulnerability and sharing and that level of self-disclosure, there's an entitlement there that is, we have to you earn trust with people, you build trust with people. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes connection, and even then I wouldn't ask this. It would be something if somebody wanted to bring up something about their lived experience, and I'm open to hear it, but I am not going to solicit it. Not going to solicit it, not with my identity. So yeah, just everything y'all said. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Thank you. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to end by reading a poem by Mickey Scott Bay-Jones and the chapter An Invitation to Brave Space and Holding Change by the incredible Adrienne Maree Brown. She's got a few books. We'd recommend all of them. Together, we will create brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in a real world. We all carry scars and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side.